here this evening, and yet again is another book that I listened to on Audible. This book is about the War of 1812. So this book is written by Donald R. Hickey. I've never read anything by this author before, but it was a very good book. It's read by Douglas R. Pratt. It's roughly about 15 hours to listen to on Audible as well, and so just to give you a bit of a summary, the War of 1812 is one of the more forgotten conflicts is the last conflict between the British and Americans after the Revolutionary War. This war is one of these ones where I think the British at best forget about the war, and the Americans also. It is one of these ones where not a lot was achieved overall in terms of the two main powers within fighting the war, whether that would be the American and the British Empire at the time. But certainly when you look at anybody who's read anything about the war, it was the last ever meaningful intervention and meaningful support act by any of the indigenous Native American tribes and allies in history. After this, it was pretty much a one-way traffic where the federal government, the American federal government, pretty much gobbled up the land, and history was history after that, and they're on in, unfortunately. So just to give a little bit summary on the book. So I got the book. I've always read around the American Revolution. That is the sexy topic. The founding, all the names: Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Adams, Patrick Henry, all of the saga of the Revolution. But what I found very interesting about this book was that it goes into very, very minute detail about you still had the original generation around at the time, and the inheritors of the original American generation. So by this time, Washington had died, so had Franklin. Jefferson had served his terms as president, so had Adams. John Quincy Adams his son would come to play a role later on in the Peace Commission with Henry Clay, I believe. But what this book is telling you really is that there was a feeling amongst the inheritors of the American Revolution, particularly the Democratic Party, which was in power, and again with James Madison, who was one of the architects of the American Constitution. So he is part of that sort of Virginia dynasty, which was already being seen to be dominating the nation's new politics. You had factional parties, so you had the Federalist Party, which is more, although Washington was not officially associated with any party because he was the bipartisan, everyone's choice to be the first president to serve his 2 terms, you may associate Washington with Federalists like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. John Adams, who would be the second president of the United States, would be a Federalist. Then thereafter, you'd have Jefferson serve his 2 terms as a Republican, and then obviously James Madison as well. Then, but what the events leading up to 1812 was showing was that the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the Revolutionary Wars in Europe after the French Revolution of 1789, America initially, as Washington had hoped, tried to disentangle itself from any European conflict. They tried to be, as we were told, isolationist, neutral. They didn't want to involve themselves in any of the conflicts of the old world while they were trying to establish themselves in the new and effectively maintain their dominance of the Western Hemisphere, certainly the northern part of the Western Hemisphere at that as well. What was really becoming crux points for the Americans was that the impressment of sailors, and this was one of the main arguments to declare war on Britain, was that the British Empire was, this was at the time, whether for right or wrong, this was a used tactic by the Royal Navy that would impress, meaning that they would basically take American or British or any other nation's sailors and impress them into service within the Royal Navy. And that was that. Sometimes you had no reproach for it. Sometimes they would re-impress people, say captured Brits who would have, say, deserted or flown, they fled the ships of the Royal Navy and gone to America to sort of establish themselves and try to use their merchant shipping perhaps, and they've been recaptured and identified. But for the most part, it was American sailors, New Englanders as well, who were being impressed into British service, and particularly after the American Revolution, Anglophobia was rife, understandably. They had to fight a revolution in order to get them out of the country. They still had regiments in Canada, or what would be British Northern Territory, now named Canada, of course, at the time as well. So there was always that sort of designs upon Canada and Quebec, but knowing as well that they could, if the opportunity struck and they were weak, that they had a known enemy, their former their former masters north over the Niagara. I think the impressment of sailors was one of the issues. There were several issues at the time. Effectively, Britain was using its domination of the seas, its hegemony of the global shipping lanes, and of course of its diplomacy to ride roughshod over other nations who were not involved in any of the coalitions against the French Republic or then Napoleon. Any neutral parties, they were effectively rode roughshod over by what British priorities, British demands were. And the Americans also, another factor was that the Americans were keen to re-establish the gains of the revolution that they had won after 1783. So you could well make a comparison between somebody already having won a fight, going back then to win it again, to show how tough, not so much to show how tough they are, but to reaffirm in the most aggressive sense their liberty, their individuality, their separateness from the former colonial masters, as it were. So there obviously was a lot of debate, and there was a huge war party in the, as it would be Jefferson's Democrats at that time. You had several different factions, but mainly the war party. They thought that they had a lot to gain and not a lot to lose because Britain's back was turned. They were concentrating on the Peninsula War at the time in Spain and Portugal to try and drive Napoleon's marshals out of there, whilst funding and aiding the Russians who were facing the French Grand Army in Napoleon's ill-fated invasion into Russia as well. They thought that they could they thought that they could make quick gains by pretty much ridding themselves of any sort of impressment upon their sailors by the Royal Navy, as well as potentially even take some territory here and there. such as, well, in particular, their desires. The Americans were on Upper Canada, as it was called at the time, and Quebec, and areas such as Newfoundland as well. But that was one of those things that led to war. So effectively, there were arguments for it. War was declared. It happened, and initially, what I found quite interesting about the war was that, our sort of pride, British pride as it was, we've been brought up on the stories of Trafalgar, we totally destroyed the French and Spanish navies in 1805 at Trafalgar. We controlled the shipping lanes, controlled the oceans, everything like that. But then, in the first part of the 1812 war, you had war was deemed by the Americans a given that they would invade Canada, take Canada, and that they would probably have a tough time on the ocean. It was actually the reverse. And what happened during Jefferson's time was that, in John Adams' time as president, he had tried to fund and build up a navy to deter any foreign power from invasion or intimidation upon the American eastern coast. Now, Jefferson's time in office, he hadn't sort of sustained that level of investment, and even sort of not so much mothballed it, but neglected to focus on that, instead focus on domestic economy, and basically ensuring that the growth of the American state under his presidency took priority over any sort of defense, because Jefferson was obviously firmly non-interventionist, and also then purchased Louisiana, or a third of the country from Napoleon anyway. So, but by the time of 1812, you had not a very large American navy, but an effective American navy for how small it was, and they had inflicted surprising defeats on British warships in 1812. Now, this was read in Britain with horror because, they believed, you've got such ships like the USS Constitution, who performed absolutely amazingly. I'd love to go and visit the Constitution in America just to see that. And that the Constitution performed absolutely amazingly. But surprisingly on land was that, you start to see and you look back at Canadian patriotism, the sort of the germination of Canadian patriotism by repelling an American invasion. Not an absolutely amazingly put together American invasion force, it was expected to do, or it was, they overwhelmed the local Canadian and British fencibles, which are like militia, but they fought to a standstill, and the invasion of Canada, the taking of Upper Canada and Quebec and Newfoundland just didn't happen. And so 1812 had passed, and the war continued for a couple of years after that. But that was a shock to the system, was it had totally gone the opposite of what everybody was thinking that the war was going to go. But in 1813 and early 1814, it settled down to what people thought was going to happen, and the strengths of each side really came through then, which was that on land the Americans started to make significant gains up in the upper New York area, near the Niagara. You had out west, you had fantastic leadership and generalship, where they were inflicting defeats upon the British and the Indian allies as well in the west. In the south, you had obviously the very famous Battle of New Orleans in 1815 with Andrew Jackson. But on the ocean, you did start to see the dominance of the British Navy really come through, because after the shock to the system that, hang on a minute, why are we losing to these? These are second-rate power, if anything, and we're losing to them, on the seas. That then soon changed, and Britain started to dominate and started to assert its dominance again on the ocean. But I thought what was more interesting at this time as well, to make a point, I want to really say that I think that the Americans did a really good job, and a massively influential generation of good generals came through at this time. They had absolutely shocking generals at the start. Old, sort of just after the Revolutionary War, generals and commanders who were long in the tooth. They were experienced, but hadn't seen significant combat. And then you had a cadre of young, really that would be very historical, very influential people coming through as commanders in their own right later on. So just to name a few, you had, like I said, you had Andrew Jackson, who would be president, one of the best presidents, I would argue, later on, despite all of his anti-Indian rhetoric, and what not rhetoric, what he actually did, his treatment, I should say. You had William Henry Harrison, who was absolutely fantastic during this war, who unfortunately will only last a few days in office as president. And then you had Winfield Scott, who was absolutely integral to the United States defeating the Mexican army and the Mexican-American War, and going all the way to Mexico City with the army. So a fantastic amount of generals at this time. But what another important factor which turned this war completely was that the Americans were hoping that Napoleon would hold firm, that nothing like a total collapse was imminent, but it did. And the impact of the Napoleonic regime falling was absolutely catastrophic for the United States. Their hope of significant gains in the war. They imposed a blockade, pretty much, of any trade with the European continent, and in particular Britain, not so much the European continent, but Britain, which stymied the New England merchant and shipping businesses in that area of the country, which caused unbelievable resentment towards the Virginia dynasty that was ruling the federal government at the time, and that had paid so much for war, and were delivering what the North were thinking was delivering nothing. They'd underfunded their navy in the eyes of the New Englanders. They'd underfunded the navy. They couldn't get across the border to Canada against a bunch of ragtag half Brits and half Frenches and some Indians. They had lucked out with a couple of engagements on the high seas, and now they're telling them they can't trade with their main trading partner. And in particular, some of the ports that were basically blockaded and were stopped then from trading by the British were the New England states as well. So effectively it was a double whammy. And the fact that Napoleon then had retreated from Russia, and his regime unravelled absolutely within about 18 months of the Russian adventure. The fact that had happened along the same time that this war was going on made the continental system, in which Napoleon had imposed upon the rest of Europe not to trade with Britain, and then that had unravelled with his defeat in Russia. The fact that the Americans had blockaded Britain was totally negligible. So the only people that they were affecting negatively were themselves and the New Englanders, in which case then caused massive sectional conflict. And you had New Englanders then wanting to, even openly talking for secession, as the South would do years later, and they formed what was called the Hartford Convention, where the delegates from New England, such as Connecticut, Massachusetts, as it would be now Rhode Island, and as it would be now Maine, would meet together in order to talk about secession. Now, how serious they were about this, we don't know, but it got to the point where they were discussing it because they felt that they were being cut off by the federal government were punishing the Yankee area, and they were going to bear the burden of the war themselves, whilst the Virginia dynasty were not going to be culpable for their mistake of actually getting themselves into the war in the first place. But what happened later on in 1813 and 1814, things settled down. The roles flipped. US became a bit more dominant on the land, a bit more effective on the land. UK, the British Empire being a bit more effective on the ocean sea. So things were going as they should have gone, really, in the historical sense. Then they started to settle down. Later on, you had in 1814, effectively both sides were longing for a peace, but not before you had a detachment of British regiments went to Washington DC, and the ultimate sort of insult and could have toppled the government, really, was the fleeing of James Madison and the cabinet, and the pretty much evacuation of Washington DC by and taken over, and the White House being burned by British soldiers, and that really coupled with a significant victory then at the Battle of New Orleans, really just sort of even the war out itself, because it could have got a hell of a lot worse for the Americans, really, when the British had actually turned around at that point, knowing that Napoleon had been done by 1814 and that they burned Washington to the ground. But I think the peace sort of feelers in the back channels, they were already being felt out a long time before then. And finally in 1814, a peace was agreed. I believe it's the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. But again, you do see with a lot of conflicts that the British delegation was woefully underperformed compared to the American delegation. You had people like a fantastic sort of array of people like Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams leading the American sort of peace negotiations, and they came away effectively unscathed, you could say. And if anything, at an advantage, because, like I said at the start, you've got the removal of the Native Americans as a major power player in any conflict between European powers on the American continent going forward. You had America's manifest destiny was laid before them effectively at that point. The sort of designs upon Canada were never again to be entertained in a serious capacity because of the indigenous. When I say indigenous, I mean the local Canadian feeling towards the American invasion. This had happened twice now, and it had been repelled both times. So they had given that up as a long-term goal. Things settled down in terms of fishing rights and where certain islands and inlets were taken over, they were returned and whatnot. But overall, the war is something that both sides would like to forget, I think, because Britain was their main priority was, of course, on defeating Napoleon on the Peninsula War. And whilst you had the Duke of Wellington was advising the British government on its American policy, he was not prepared to embark and go to America and fight there whilst he had finished his business against Napoleonic France. So, in that sense, Britain wants to forget this war because we were effectively surprised and a little bit ashamed and humiliated in the first in quite a few naval engagements with the Americans, and we didn't really gain anything. It's not as if the British gained New England or Ohio or anything like that. Nothing was gained materially. Nothing was gained for the British apart from reputation restored because of defeating Napoleon and burning the White House, and off we go. That's it. We can come and do that whenever we want. The Americans were, again, they want to forget this because of, whilst they had had some fantastic successes on the ocean initially, things did start to settle down, and the neglectfulness of not funding the Navy did come back to bite the Americans in 1813 and 1814, as did the lack of effectiveness in taking over Canada early on in the war. And obviously the burning of Washington DC was a major factor. These are probably main factors why they want to forget the war as well. But I love reading about this particular war because, like I say, it is the last ever engagement between the British and the Americans. There are, just to go over the pricing of the book, so you've got it on Kindle for $7.37. I got this on Audible for $8.99, so I would probably, looking at the price in there, hardcover's £21, paperback £17. I'd probably say go for the Audible personally. It is a good read anyways as well, so it is something that I'd probably go for Audible on this one personally. With the War of 1812, it's not a very, as you would say, like a sexy war in the sense of, like, you've got there's a massive amount of American Civil War. Surprisingly, not so much about the Revolutionary War, but the Revolutionary War is held up like in the pantheon of conflicts because of it is the Americans' foundings. In Britain, we heard nothing about the War of 1812. All we know about in 1812 is that Napoleon was invading Russia. We were kicking him out of Spain at that time, and that is it. As far as we were concerned and taught in history in schools, there was no War of 1812. It doesn't get mentioned whatsoever. So I'm glad, again, it's one of these things as a historian and trying to be a lover of history, you want to uncover, you want to turn stones over and find things that you never knew, neglected areas, and think, that's quite interesting. So there's other books I would want to recommend. The one film I want to recommend, though, which is it's a really older film, but it's pretty good, called The Buccaneer. And it's in regards to a pirate by the name of John Lafitte. It's a true story, who assisted Andrew Jackson to repel the British from New Orleans in the War of 1812 in 1815. So, effectively you had privateers helping out the fledgling American Republic at that point as well. So that's a brilliant film. It's obviously, it's from 1958. You've got people like Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston. So it's a classic. If you like older films like that, it's a brilliant one. Other books to look on the topic, if you are interested, would be The War 1812 by Walter R. Boardman. You have this book that I had for my birthday as well, which is called The Civil War of 1812. American citizens, British subjects, Irish rebels, and Indian allies. And this obviously is focusing way more on the Canadian aspect of this and the different citizens, different change of allegiances as the war progressed. The Challenge is another real good book, which I've got on my wish list to buy, actually. So the Britain against America in the Naval War of 1812, which we'll touch upon a little bit more about what I mentioned earlier on as well, then about the way the conflict went. You have this one, which this is more of a if you're a history teacher or you want to look at the military aspect of the 1812 war, is the Essential Histories War of 1812. And now I have this collection ongoing at the moment. There's about 70 or 80 books in this collection. I've probably got about 50 of them, but they are very good, very well focused on the military aspects. They do go into the reasons for the war and whatnot, but more so these are for if you want to study the actual layout of the battle, how the battle progressed. what pieces we use, what regiments and whatnot, and that is way more detailed in that aspect. So there's another book called Patriotic Fire, which is Andrew Jackson and John Lafitte and the Battle of New Orleans. So this one I've only just seen a couple of minutes ago, so I'm actually going to add this to my wish list. So that one's going in there to buy later on. And another film to have a look at would be, I found this absolutely great. It looks quite low budget, but again, you don't get anything on the War of 1812, and this is called Mohawk. So it's about, you have a British soldier fleeing into Indian territory, and with a pursuing band of American soldiers who come across Mohawk Indians in their own territory. And of course, things don't go down very well, and the Mohawk Indians decide to fight back and seek revenge against the American invaders. So, yeah, another good film to have a look at. But overall, I mean, I like to give the book probably a 4 out of 5, to be honest. It is a pretty good detailed explanation about the War of 1812. I don't think, if you know nothing about the conflict, and you do want to know a detailed version of it, read this. If you want an introduction, I would offer to say read something a bit more mainstream before you read this book. But for somebody who has read on the topic, this is the one for you. This is a really good book, and it gives you context, it gives you detailed information, and the multi-layer again. You know it's a good book when it gives you such an extended multi-layer explanation about what was going on all sides. So yeah, overall, absolutely fantastic book, and yeah, 4 out of 5 stars. If you have any comments at all, put them in the comment box below. If you would mind liking the video, and definitely subscribe to the channel. I've got a couple more history book reviews coming up as well, and share the video if you enjoyed it as well. But